here today. I can see some faces and the rest blurred out, but welcome to the hybrid working webinar for HR Lunch Club today. We're going to do about 20 to 30 minutes on some of the legal issues that arise when considering hybrid working. And then at the end, if you'd like to ask any questions, please do pop them in the chat or shout out, and we can cover some of those topics. Today's session is really an overview. We are going to be presenting a more detailed seminar as a masterclass in October, and I think at the end of the session we've got the date there for your diaries if you're interested in that as well, which will be a CPD certified event. So really looking in overview at some of the employment law considerations for hybrid working. Let me just press continue, but I've lost the ability, Helen, to move my mouse. Apologies, everybody. I don't know if you can take over my screen, Helen. There we go, sorted. Control Alt Delete works every time. There we go. So ACAS have defined hybrid working as a flexible working option where employees split their time between the workplace and working remotely. Now, obviously there's no legal definition particularly of hybrid working, but clearly this has come out of the pandemic for many employers, although hybrid working was certainly an option for lots of employers pre-COVID, but now very much mainstream. I think what happened with COVID was that lots of employers very quickly adapted and put in place informal arrangements, which have then, I suppose, evolved, developed, and question mark, have you, where you're in that situation, actually put in place a strategy to really manage the future of hybrid working within your organisation, how it's going to work, what teams it might be applicable for, and whether this is now going to be an irreversible shift. Are we looking at permanence here, or is this still a temporary arrangement that you're looking to roll back on and maybe change? And so that's something to think about. What we're looking at from an HR perspective is lots of different models that are being mooted and discussed. And of course, consultation with your staff is really important on that. We're seeing the 3-2 model, 3 days in the office, 2 at home. The 2-3 model, which is of course the reverse, 2 days in the office, 3 at home. The 50-50. And then the anytime, any place, anywhere, which is, I suppose, more the minority of employers, but certainly becoming more popular and developing as a trend where employees get to choose exactly what their arrangements is going to be and can make that up as they go along each week, which of course will very much depend on your organisation as to what might be viable. So where there is complete freedom of choice, that's going to need really careful consideration about the implications of that, particularly from a health and safety perspective, as well as planning sufficient cover in the office and that kind of thing. So there are many opportunities with hybrid working. What I say to you today isn't intended to put you off. I am a fan of hybrid working myself. So whatever I say today, please don't think that I'm trying to put you off. There are lots of opportunities. And actually, I think for many employers, if you don't offer it, there is of course a risk that your competitors will, and actually is that going to be a recruitment and retention issue for you? So do bear that in mind. Although of course, where I say here there are threats, there are some issues to consider with hybrid working, and of course with every new project there will be challenges as well as the opportunities, so we'll have a little look at those as well. So benefits and drawbacks. Well, briefly, with benefits, of course, there's been lots of statistics, lots of reports that have identified that productivity has actually increased quite significantly and markedly with working from home. So no doubt for those of you who are considering hybrid working as a more permanent fixture, you'll have seen that it hasn't impacted negatively on your productivity, in fact, quite the opposite. So where people have made up time with what would have otherwise been commuting and all the rest of the time that's wasted in getting to work, that has often been used as time for productive work. However, obviously on the other side of things, could there be an issue in terms of overdependence on technology? Have we had issues there? Reduced support, culture changes, and also perceived loss of control, and how we then tackle those issues in order to effectively manage hybrid working. Some complexities then. With failing to plan, we plan to fail. And obviously, as with any large project, it's so important to consider all the different aspects of what you're looking to achieve and look at risk assessing it before you roll it out. Obviously, as part of that, you want to be engaging with your workforce, looking at what everybody wants and making sure that what you're not implementing is something that nobody wants, because that's not going to particularly be landing with popularity. So always think, make sure that you risk assess, you really carefully consider what you're going to implement before you do it, because of course the potential consequences for getting it wrong could be quite significant and costly. So do the planning. Just because you've already rolled something out and you've already had your pandemic plan in place doesn't mean that's the right one to continue with. It may be that you're looking to make changes with your hybrid working model. So do consider logistics, what arrangements are available, what's going to be viable. It may be that you're not going to have the same plan for everybody in the organisation. Some roles will of course be suitable for hybrid working and others won't be. Therefore, you may need to take a team by team or department by department approach. It may be that different sites, if you're a multi-site operation, will need a different approach depending on the needs of your organisation. So again, factor all those things in. Logistics also include, of course, your requirement for a certain amount of people on site. So if you have, under normal circumstances, particular number of first aiders, fire marshals, that type of thing, you're going to have to bear that in mind with who needs to be in the office on what days and whether you need to increase the number of people trained to be a fire marshal or a first aider, for example, on those days, if you're going to have a rota-based system. And that's something to factor in on who needs to be in on what days. And that might also impact on how flexible you can be about your hybrid working arrangements. Then looking at expectations, we don't want to have a mismatch of expectations from what your employees are looking for by way of flexibility and what your management teams and leaders expect. That's, again, going down the role of disaster, isn't it, if we go down that route? So let's roll back and identify what it is as a business where we're looking to achieve. What do our leaders and managers need from teams in terms of availability, presence? Is that something that then is conducive to hybrid working, and also risk assessing that against what employees are looking for as well? In terms of communication and culture, obviously really key important considerations include etiquette, communication streams, dress codes from working from home as well as in the office. Do people present in the same professional way when they're working from home? Or is there, and again, how will you maintain company culture where people are less likely to be in the office together as much? This is something we've all been working on as we've gone along over the last 18 months. And it's something now to review in terms of what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, and how we want to implement things moving forward. Then obviously it's going to be really important to assess what flexibility you're prepared to offer, making sure that you identify what rules you need to adopt, what policies you need to update, and making sure that those policies don't contradict each other. So if you're going to implement a hybrid working policy, do you need to align that with your home working policy? Do you need to align that with your confidentiality arrangements? Absolutely you do. And your health and safety at work and health and safety from working from home arrangements, etc. And of course, finally, management commitment is absolutely crucial. We'll come on to that again at the end, but clearly your leaders need to buy into this in order that you'll achieve the success of the project. And that might involve some training as well. So moving on to legal obligations now, let's firstly consider what our employer's obligations are. Well, number one, let's look at the contract. Do we need to update the contracts of employment? Again, it will depend on what arrangements you're looking to make and whether that would involve a required variation of contract, particularly in terms of hours, place of work, that type of thing. We also have statutory obligations, which we'll come on to consider. The duty of care for health and safety compliance, and again, looking at home working risk assessments, provision of equipment, that kind of thing. And then, of course, data protection, confidentiality, those work both ways, and looking at how we're going to manage that effectively so that both sides have confidence in the arrangement. including those obligations we might have to third parties whose data we process. And then, of course, bearing in mind always the principles of reasonableness and fairness that underpin the employment relationship and all employment law in looking at how we're going to implement the new arrangements, and that implied duty of trust and confidence. And likewise also making sure that whatever we do, we risk assess against our Equality Act obligations as well. So whenever we're looking to introduce a change, could that potentially give rise to any risk of indirectly discriminating against certain protected groups? And if so, is there a way we can do that differently to eliminate that inadvertent risk of discrimination? Or if not, is there a way that we can reduce the impact of any potential discriminatory impact on certain groups? So again, always have in mind the Equality Act in introducing any change. So starting with contractual considerations, Section 1 of the Employment Rights Act dictates that we have to provide a statement of particulars of employment, which must include key terms. So place of work is a key one, isn't it? Should this be changed to include the home address, if home address is now going to be a normal place of work? Well, if somebody's permanently going to be required to work from home, and that's a change to the contract, then that might be something we need to think about. If, however, it's a voluntary arrangement where employees can choose to work from home, but actually their main place of work is going to be an office or whatever normal workplace site, then it may not be necessary, but do think about getting legal advice on that particular issue, because that, of course, impacts then working time issues in terms of setting off to go travel from the normal place of work. It also includes expenses for that as well. Then look at hours of work. So is the employee going to be able to set their own hours of work when it's a home working day? Or are you expecting them to be logged on and working from home on a home working day for those same hours that they would otherwise do if they're in the office? Or can there be some elements of flexibility? Again, it will entirely depend on the role and the expectations and the requirements for that role, and their availability to be available for colleagues, clients, teams, customers, etc. But do have a think about that, because this will form the basis of the rules for your policy and whether or not you need to update the contract. And again, it may be that that differs between roles, it differs between teams. You don't have to have exactly the same rule throughout, as long as you are fair and not discriminating. Okay. Don't forget about record keeping requirements. So of course, if you're going to expect an employee to manage their own time, it's important that they do take rest breaks and their daily rest is accounted for. And so, you know, in our world, it's very easy for us to demonstrate what hours we've done because we log our time as part of our job. However, not all roles do that in the same way. So just be conscious of looking at working time. How are you going to manage that? And are you aware of whether an employee has, for example, picked up a second job during lockdown, and do you have rules around disclosure of that? Because it's important for you to know the total hours of work that somebody's undertaking, not just the hours of work that they're doing for you. Okay. Home equipment, again, is that a contractual offering that you have? Are you looking at providing more equipment for people working from home, such as the provision of mobile telephones if people are using their own personal phones while working from home? Is that something that you need to consider? Adaptations to workstations for working from home. We've seen some anecdotal evidence of people at A&E having used an ironing board for a workstation, and then of course the whole thing collapses. Not only is that then a health and safety issue and a potential injury to report, how do we report accidents at home and who's liable is a whole other subject for a debate on another day. But not only that, what do we feel about somebody placing company equipment on an ironing board that subsequently collapses and the whole lot goes west? So all these things to think about in terms of rules around work safety at home. And a lot of it is common sense, but not everybody has common sense all of the time. So although we don't necessarily think it should be necessary to write these things down, sometimes it is important. And in our experience as HR professionals, we know that sometimes even the most obvious of rules need to still be set out clearly. Pay and benefits. So think about pay and whether or not you are looking to change pay. We've seen some fairly controversial news headlines in the last few weeks around companies or even MPs proposing that people working from home should have a reduction in certain pay. Some companies looking at removing things like London waiting, where individuals have moved outside of the city and therefore are no longer having the commuting costs that they would have otherwise had. If you are seeking to change pay or benefits as a result of working from home, do bear in mind what I said before about your contractual statutory obligations. Any variation of pay that's not advantageous to an employee could, of course, be a breach of contract issue. Not only that, could it then potentially give rise to Equality Act claims as well, particularly bearing in mind that statistically it's more likely that perhaps people with disabilities and or caring responsibilities, that triggers age and gender usually, are more likely to be keen to work from home, although not necessarily, of course, it'll depend on the makeup of your workforce, but just consider the risks there. Confidentiality, an absolutely key one in all of this, is making sure that you have express contractual provisions that are updated to be relevant to the new circumstances that you find yourselves in. So making sure that it's clear that other household members should not be afforded access to your confidential data, and how that's going to be protected to reduce any risk, and also to make sure that you're not then breaching your obligations to your third parties that you hold data for as well, and how that data needs to be secured safely and confidentially. And then, of course, if it needs to be destroyed, how it should be done, i.e. not in the back garden fire pit on a Saturday night at part of the party. Restrictive covenants, again, if somebody is now working from a different location, that may render some of the restrictive covenants in contracts ineffective and no longer relevant. And if they're no longer relevant, they're not going to be able to protect you in the event that you're looking to enforce them. So do make sure that you review restrictive covenants for post-termination anti-competitive practice that you're looking to protect in respect of your business interests. So have a think about that. Again, that's something that we can help with. We offer free contract reviews for companies, and so if it's the case that you're looking for some guidance on what you might want to update, then please get in touch and we're happy to guide you. Also, think about the right to monitor and enter. Are you looking to reserve the contractual right to visit somebody at home to check that they are complying with your arrangements that you've agreed, and whether or not that's proportionate? And likewise, also, if you need to enter their home in order to undertake some maintenance work of any company property that has been installed in their home in order to work effectively. And again, depending on the role, it may be something that you consider to be proportionate and necessary. If you do make contractual changes, then you'll need to think about updating the contracts with a Section 4 statement, and that needs to be issued within a month of the change taking effect. If you're just making non-contractual changes and it's a policy, then obviously still engage on that. So the new contract will be, sorry, bear with me, subject to trial periods, reviews, and will be something that you want to keep under review. So if, for example, you adopt a trial period that is for 6 months, don't allow that to just elapse without it being reviewed. Make sure that your trial period is still negotiated, looked at, reviewed, and then assessed. So then if the trial period is going to be something that you want to turn into a permanent arrangement, that you ensure that you confirm its success. Will a letter suffice? Well, absolutely, if you're not going to make too many changes. However, if you have significant changes, you may wish to update contracts. Consider whether mobility clauses will be effective, and again, we can advise on that separately if you've got any specific concerns. And do you need hybrid working contracts? Well, if you're going to have specific roles for hybrid working moving forward, then yes, absolutely, we can help with introducing hybrid working contracts for you. Consultation. If you're looking to enforce changes to contractual terms, then that will trigger the obligation to consult with employees. And obviously you need to go through a fair and reasonable consultation process. Collective consultation obligations will apply where you're looking to make changes to 20 or more employees within a 90-day period. And so bear in mind all of the obligations that go along with that. And likewise, you may also have collective agreements that might trigger if you're looking to make changes. So look at whether you have any specific provisions with trade unions or works council that would also trigger the requirement to consult as well. But in any event, it's a good idea to consult with your teams and your employees around any proposed changes such as hybrid working. And that's really important for engagement, motivation, and also making sure that employees feel they've been listened to, and they may have some great ideas on how the hybrid working models could work within your business. And of course, don't forget any applicable notice periods before effecting any enforced changes if you are looking to enforce a particular change rather than agree it voluntarily. So moving on now to look at what should be in your hybrid working policy. So first of all, make sure that you understand that the employees need to know the status of the policy. So hopefully your policy would be non-contractual, because any contractual terms should be in the contract. Non-contractual policies are far better because you can update them without breaching the contractual terms. Identify who eligible employees will be. So for example, are you going to require an employee to pass a probationary program or period in order to be eligible for for hybrid working? Or will you extend it to all employees from day one? And likewise, will all types of employees be entitled, or only certain roles eligible for hybrid working? So of course, that will depend on your business. Look at who will have responsibility for the policy and for the arrangements, and how it will be reviewed. And then also what you're going to do in terms of the applicable rules, including reserving the right to terminate or vary the policy as appropriate. Then also in your hybrid working policy, you might want to consider any rules around location of hybrid working. So for example, it might be acceptable to you for employees to be working from home, but probably not from the local cafe if their role includes any kind of confidentiality to it. But it might be that you're quite happy for people to have networking meetings in cafes as before, again, subject to the type of work they do. You may not particularly want them logged on in their laptop doing more confidential nature work anywhere other than a confidential office-based room at home or at an appropriate work location. So again, bear that in mind in drafting your policy. You might want appropriate provisions to make it clear what is and is not acceptable. And likewise, are they allowed to work abroad? So if somebody has a second home abroad, that obviously triggers all sorts of jurisdictional questions over social security, visa, tax and issues and data protection issues. So just be conscious of what is acceptable in terms of where and how far is far enough, I suppose. Is it okay for somebody to work at a family member's home if they want to go visit their sister or their brother or parents somewhere further away? So again, will that be acceptable to you, or do you require confidence that somebody has a confidential space that's appropriate for the type of work they do? So confidentiality plays a key element in all your considerations here, really, and likewise data security also. Then looking at management. So how are managers going to be expected to organise and to run the day-to-day performance management of their team? How are you going to deal with grievances, disciplinaries, and all of that? So do bear that in mind as well. Make sure that managers understand that hybrid workers need to be supervised and appraised in the same way as any other workers, and how appropriate communications need to be adapted and then adopted within teams. Think about appropriate training for managers to make sure that they understand their obligations. And some companies are adopting this as part of the KPIs for managers in order that those managers are engaged in supporting the hybrid working models as well. And then, are you going to require a certain minimum level of workplace attendance to a normal office or site-based place of work? And again, whether you're going to allow flexibility on what those days are, or whether you're going to stipulate the days that somebody has to come in on a rota-based arrangement. Obviously, if it's going to be left up to employees to choose, of course, some days will be much more popular than others, and obviously that then is something that you need to bear in mind in terms of what you can manage within the space that you now have, and whether that space is the same as it was, or whether you have reduced or expanded in the time that has elapsed since pre-COVID times, and whether you need to think about a hot desking system, or whether people will still have their old workspace available to them. So bear that in mind as well. We've talked a little bit about health and safety, but make sure that your risk assessments are updated, suitable, and also think about lone worker considerations. Now, the Susie Lamplugh Trust offers quite good support and guidance for those of you who are interested in that, if you've not looked at that aspect of home working as well. And of course, mental health and well-being is also really important to consider. We've talked a little bit about equipment, but also make sure that you consider whether or not a provision of equipment may be a reasonable adjustment for somebody who might have a disability. So again, don't forget the equality aspect that comes into that consideration also. And whether or not you're going to fund equipment, or whether you require employees to fund it. And likewise, the insurance that you require an employee to take out, and whether they are to fund that insurance themselves, or whether you will be funding any additional insurance to cover home working and the provision of equipment cover for those home working arrangements as well. So the next consideration is beyond the contract, the policy, is to look at statutory protection. And obviously, where a claim arises, it could be a contractual type of claim. It could be a claim for unfair dismissal or constructive unfair dismissal if an employee resigns. And again, the reasonableness and fairness is really important in considering that. Likewise, protective award claims, if somebody has a claim for a failure to inform and consult following a failure to go through the collective consultation obligations. So do bear in mind that there are potential claims arising if we fundamentally change someone's contract and they resign in response, and we didn't go through the appropriate collective consultation period prior to effecting that change, and observe the appropriate notice periods. So that's the why, really, from a legal liability perspective. Bear in mind the part-time workers regulations and the fact that part-time workers have protection from less favourable treatment, in addition to our Equality Act considerations, which I've touched on already. And again, we've looked a little bit about health and safety. So this slide just again reminds us to focus on making sure that this is always at the forefront of our considerations when adopting a new working pattern and system. And then let's think about some tricky issues that might crop up from hybrid working. What about the two-tier treatment that has been discussed quite widely now in various forums, in particular the CIPD, ACAS? They're talking about how to prevent a two-tier treatment arrangement where people who are out of sight are out of mind. And obviously, presence bias has always been an issue within workplaces, and certainly presenteeism. So for example, what do we think about hybrid meetings where we have some people joining a meeting remotely and other people physically present in a meeting room, and the two together? Should all meetings be one or the other? Should we have only only virtual meetings, or only meetings in person, or is a blend workable? And I suppose the answer to that is it depends how it's managed and how those engaged within the meeting understand the importance of collaboration on both virtual platforms and in presence. But certainly lots of guidance says don't have mixed meetings, as there's a potential for employees to be excluded for those who are having conversations in the room, where those who are on the virtual platform can't necessarily take part, and perhaps those water cooler conversations that take place just before or just after the meeting, although technically could that happen anyway? So just be alive and self-aware to those potential risks, and then there are definitely ways of overcoming these risks and making sure that we look at the right way to work in practice. Also, work allocation and provision of work opportunities is important to consider as well. What we don't want is a situation where only those who are present in the office are getting all the best opportunities for work, and opportunities that could then, I suppose, fast track promotion opportunities and pay rises and bonuses, leaving those who are working from home and perhaps out of sight less likely to be eligible for those opportunities. So this is important in terms of career development, and again looking back to the Equality Act issue there and the risk of potential discrimination claims in the world of preferential treatment. So just be conscious of that. Another tricky issue that's no doubt going to be relevant is what is acceptable levels of monitoring. Lots of companies have started introducing more virtual monitoring through monitoring employees working from home using webcams and virtual keyboard stroke monitoring tracking systems and things like that, and is that acceptable and justified? And of course that will, the answer to that will, it depends. Certainly close monitoring of and recording of communications is actually required for certain organisations such as those who are regulated by the FCA and the PRA. So yes, in those circumstances without question, but not all the time. And so also again, engage, consult with your employees over what is an acceptable level of monitoring, and balancing that against maintaining trust and confidence within your workplace and with your employees. And then finally, just a reminder of the real importance of buy-in at all levels of the business. This is obviously top down, making sure that your managers understand that if you're going to introduce this new way of working, that they need to be bought into it, they need to commit to it and be trained in effective hybrid management arrangements, and how you should then as HR be able to bring round the cynic and challenge any inaccurate and negative assumptions about home working and hybrid working arrangements. Because I think where in the past it has had negative connotations attached to it, I think over the last 12 months, data is now out there for you to show those cynics that actually productivity is increased in the majority of circumstances, and perhaps even more so in a hybrid arrangement where it's 100% home working. You can get that kind of overwhelm and tiredness at the end of it, whereas if there's a good hybrid arrangement, you can perhaps have the best of both worlds from all perspectives. And finally, a question mark: can staff be required to work from home? Well, I think the answer is absolutely yes, if you've got the right to in your contract to require it. In the absence of that, it's going to be a negotiation. It's going to either require consent, or you're going to have to go through a consultation process in the absence of voluntary agreement. But again, remember that requirement for consultation. So that's just a very top line overview of some of the considerations for hybrid working. Just a bit of a summary there in terms of all the things as a takeaway really from me. And I think our slides are going to be shared after this session. So moving on, we have a masterclass on hybrid working, which is due to be on the 6th of October. And it's a full morning session, and we'd be really delighted to see you there. And as part of that, we'll obviously go into much more detail over what to include in a policy, how to introduce it effectively, and then how to manage hybrid working well so that it succeeds within your organisation, and then looking much more in depth at the legal obligations that I've touched on this morning. And thank you for your session. Now, does anybody have any questions?
Very quiet.